The Futures of Difference podcast with Steven Vertovec and Georg Diez.
Hi, I'm Steve Vertovec. I'm an anthropologist and director of the Max Planck Institute for the study of religious and ethnic diversity. And I've spent a career in various contexts around the world looking at social categories, the way that people construct them, the political dimensions of these categories, and especially the everyday implications of these categories, how they affect social relationships and various forms of inequality. And this podcast series will be looking at social categories of difference, often the way that social categories are talked about, different groups and categories differentiating themselves from one another. And I think it's a particularly crucial time to be looking at these sorts of changes because a lot of these social categories are changing before our very eyes. Certain elements, particularly on the populist right, are taking key categories around race and ethnicity, sexuality and gender, and often changing them, homogenizing, simplifying, and even villainizing some of these categories. So right now is a crucial time to have this kind of podcast series to think about social categories, what they mean to people, what they mean in structuring society. I'm really glad to be joined in this series by my friend Georg Diez, who's a journalist and writer who has a background at looking at these sorts of issues as well, and great to be talking about these things with someone like you.
No, it's a pleasure, and it's also a pleasure to be a fellow at your institute, so that is our connection in discussing all these issues. But as you say, I've been writing about these questions for a while, and how this country that I sort of live in, Germany, changed in the last 10 years or so. I was a long-time journalist for Spiegel, left Spiegel in 2018-19, partly I think also because I was just frustrated, exhausted by the debate around the migration crisis and how the media sort of talked about that. And I wrote about that in my book, The Other Country, this Anderland, where I tried to describe those changes actually that were happening in the public sphere in some way, how identity was constructed, or like enemies were constructed, or how this othering was taking place, so I'm really happy to re-engage here with you on these really serious questions that are at the core of so much of today's and mostly, I guess, tomorrow's political debate, as the podcast is called, The Futures of Difference. I think this is really a really key project to understand how democracies will and should evolve.
Yeah, I'm particularly glad to have this conversation with you. We've had many conversations about similar issues in the past, and I've always found them very productive, and not least because you're not a fellow academic, and so you keep me from going down some of these scholarly rabbit holes and using too much jargon and so forth. So I'm glad you're here to be a conversation partner in that sort of sense as well, but also for the perspectives that you're going to bring to these sorts of issues. So talking about things.
Proud non-academic, yeah.
There you go. So here we go, and we'll be looking at lots of different issues across these next episodes, and I look forward to that.
Me too.
The Futures of Difference podcast